Okay, well, yeah, you could proceed, I think. We'll yeah.
Okay, well, nice to meet you all. I think we'll get a chance in the second half of our talk to do more formal introductions, so I can just learn a little bit about you. I know that Kim in this course always tries to deliver a dose of ethics content to get you guys to think long and hard about some of the other material that's presented. You know, I think some of the astounding technologies compel us to think deeply about how they might get used, by whom, when, you know, and I haven't had a chance to talk to Kim about how the pandemic affects the expectation of the arrival of the singularity, but you know, that's something we can get to eventually. But my name's Gary Goldsand, so I'm an ethicist. I'm working at a hospital in Saskatchewan right now, so you may not be able to tell that this room is in Saskatoon, but I'm a longtime Edmontonian and maintain you know, doing my academic work at U of A through the John Doster Health Ethics Center. And so I really wanted to just add a bit. I know that Michael Van Manen gave you a very nice dose of ethical theory recently. You know, I know it's a long list and hard to internalize sometimes, but I guess am inviting you to, you know, I guess maybe use a bit of some of what he introduced to you to look inward and self-reflect. I found that most human beings already have a system of understanding, internalizing, and managing ethical issues. And so in some ways, it's an invitation to figure out how have you done this in the past, maybe encourage you to think about why that is, and just to think a little bit more deeply about how the so-called ethical theory plays out in the real world. You know, I don't think we're under any illusions that ethical theory is a systematic type of tool that you pull out and input data into. I think there are invitations to think about how you think, and in the end, I think to increase the confidence you have in any decisions you make. So, you know, that's probably enough background. I'm going to do attempt to share my screen, and I'm really going to try to keep to the promise of going through these slides quickly. All right, so you can see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, I can do the full screen thing if that's okay. So ethics and pandemics, what might we learn? So the goal for today, you should have gotten a question this morning along these lines. What lessons have you been learning during our current pandemic that might be key in preparing for the next one? So hopefully you have just had a chance to jot down some of the things that have popped into your head as being, you know, relevant and new and somewhat pressing in the real world. You know, and then to do that second order step back, you know, and think about your own thinking. How is it that we learn from history? How is it that we take in, you know, apparent realities in the world, internalize them and translate them into belief and action? You know, and I think all of this stuff, you know, I mean, the method that we'll go through today can pretty well be used to apply to any of the technologies that are discussed in the course when you step back and think of, well, how might this be absorbed into society in a good and healthy way? So this is, I think, just another version of the question. I probably meant to delete this slide. I think the last one replaced it. It's always nice to have a picture. This is one of those many common sayings. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I think it hangs pretty prominently in 20th century culture. George Santayana, American philosopher. So just a couple more comments about ethics, health ethics, clinical ethics, what it is. So I would describe it as a practical, applied academic discipline that seeks to facilitate good decisions via good decision-making processes. So in some ways, it's in the clinical setting, the main thing that an ethicist or an ethics committee are attempting to achieve by their interactions and interventions is assisting people to make really good decisions in complex situations by having the feeling that they have considered all of the relevant options from all directions. And that's, I'd say, as much a service for the clinicians, the doctors and nurses and people that work there, as it is for the patients and the families. So just this distinction isn't always made, but I think it's important. There are different words that are used, but I like to use the word descriptive ethics to answer the question, what is going on? How are decisions made? Things like, how does society come to have the beliefs that it supports, or how do individuals make decisions? It's an attempt to look at the world as it is and describe, people's actual reasons and motivations for doing things. And the idea is that understanding that is very helpful when we have to ask the prospective question in the future, what should we do? So the word normative it has a technical meaning within philosophy that, it doesn't exactly mean the same as the word normal. Normative comes from the word according to norms. What are the norms? So the normative question in philosophy is always, what should we do? Or what should somebody do? What ought they to do? So I can simplify it as the should or ought question is the normative question. When people speak of normative ethics, they're talking about how do we get to what the rules should be based on whatever method of analysis we're using. So just to, while ethics is located in philosophy, I think the world of health ethics, in order to take in all of the information that it needs to think thoroughly through all of the issues that it confronts, it needs the whole university, not just a philosophy department. The philosophy department in some ways helps us think about our thinking, has a great history in ethics with examples of famous philosophers that have given us the foundations. So if you hear about ethical principles, or this word called deontological, that often comes from Immanuel Kant, philosophers like that. So there's a rich history in philosophy. But within medicine and nursing, I think a lot of knowledge about the history of health ethics is enhanced when you look at the history of medicine, all the way back, I think, starting with the Greeks and the Hippocratic tradition, and then to recognize some of the changes that took place maybe in the 19th century, the earliest codes of medical ethics. And then, famous role model physicians like Osler, or some of the famous names, or in nursing like Florence Nightingale. And when you look at the history, which is it's a nice academic literature, it I think helps orient one in questions of health ethics. So law, I think underlying all of ethics is the law. The law creates sort of the general rules that we have to live by. But we know that most interesting questions require a finer dive in than the law provides. Obviously in health ethics, we can't violate the law in any obvious way. But I think the rise of health ethics recognizes that the law isn't going to answer specific questions like, should we remove the ventilator from this person? It's going to require an application of the law with more details. So comparative religion and spirituality, asking fundamental questions of what do people believe and why, how do they organize in communities around those beliefs? How has the nature of belief of all types changed over the years? The very interesting question of, is modern secular humanism actually freedom from religion, or is it simply another type of religion that has the same type of implicit commitments to a fundamental truth? But they're all, it's valuable to think about when we're thinking about the things that drive individuals to believe something or other, or see certain realities as obvious or not obvious. The social sciences, I think in some ways they have had a struggle in the university in the last 20 or 30 years, but I think they are still incredibly valuable. So, I mean, the history of psychology, sort of, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung and the people that came after them in the, mainly 20th century, doing some very interesting work about how the human mind works. And, some of it is no longer timely, but it's very much worth looking at. I think at the very least, the psychological analysis provides a framework for thinking about how the human mind might work. Sociology is similar, but it's instead of looking at the individual mind, it looks at group behaviors. How do people seem to behave in groups? And I can imagine there's all sorts of good research that could be done during the these days of the pandemic, looking at how have we as a group responded in an age of the internet, in in a public arena where you're not quite sure whom to trust. So anthropology, things like looking back at history and what can we learn from the ancients and whatnot. So all of those things, I fear sometimes get forgotten about when we need to look at the complexity of any health ethics question. That in some of those other departments are key bits of information if we really want to consider the whole picture. And then things like general sciences, what do we know, from the most basic level of physics to the slightly higher level of chemistry to the slightly higher level of biology, how do those feed into what we might know? And when we, even what we learn about, the smallest things, what's going on at the atomic level and the subatomic level, and, and quantum theory, which attempts to describe those relationships, do those possibly have anything to do with ethics? Or are they a different field? In my mind, they all need to feed in to anybody who's analyzing a tough question, because they all might be relevant. So different types of history. We can sort of look back over decades or centuries or millennia, and ask the simple question, here's the historical story as it comes to us, told by somebody. Are there any obvious or non-obvious lessons we can extract from it? We can look back over days and weeks, like what happened earlier today or yesterday or last week, and does it scream out anything in particular about how we ought to behave today? Often it does. I think, as I'll say, the stark reality of what's going on in the world, when our jaw drops from the news or something, I think we're in a position to be moved to new sensibilities about what ought to happen. So the history of medicine and nursing can create the same sort of sensibility. If we look at, well, how did doctors and nurses behave? If we hear a story of the nursing profession in the 1930s, which is very different than now, and we see that it's described as a profession where the thing to do is to follow the orders of the doctor and make sure they get done, which is a very different vision of what nursing is today. It's a much more of an independent profession, still on the same team as the doctor, but not created to serve the needs of that person. So other types of history, so the patient history in an area of health ethics, if it is a question, so-and-so's in an ICU and we're wondering if we should remove them from the ventilator because we don't think they're going to do well. Looking at the history of this patient might be very relevant, and then we can ask all sorts of questions. How well is the history of the patient written down? Who wrote it down? Was it by people who knew them? So you can see in all of these ways, these little bits of history can inform our sensibilities. So the local healthcare history, what has happened in this hospital or in this unit in recent months or years that may affect how people think. Critical incidents and errors, it's a central issue in health ethics. How should we deal with medical errors? It's often a question of when do we need to tell the patient or the family who is the victim of the error, and how do we deal with the reality that a lot of people are going to think, I wonder if I don't need to tell that person about the error. And so that's an ethical reality that people face. But it creates this imperative to learn from the past, and I think, I won't describe it, but all the reasons why, but I think it's almost like a fundamental principle, taking from Santayana's slide, he who doesn't learn from the past is condemned to suffer for that. And so I do think that there is this imperative, and that's part of why, I think this is a potentially important discussion. And so what happens when we learn of the historical event? There's an initial emotional response. And I'm not sure if Michael the other day, I think he might have mentioned, the ethical method that's sort of a non-method is called Intuitionism. Sort of just you take in the case or the reality and just, it hits you initially before you've had a chance to process it. And sometimes I think what ethical theory attempts to do is refine our initial intuitive response. And then I would argue elsewhere that when the time comes to decide, I think we decide more from our guts than our heads. I think we use our head to take in all the information, to use the theory, to think of the rules and the outcomes. But I think when the moment of decision comes, we go back to our gut. And I mean, that's sort of a crude metaphor. We can have a rational, considered response. If A and B happened and we know that they are good or bad, then we should, take action to prevent them or encourage them from happening in the future, that sort of thing. We want to improve our understanding of how certain situations lead to predictable outcomes. So when we talk about consequentialist ethics, an ethics that is going to aim to identify a desired outcome and then achieve it, when we're thinking of that, we always want to tinker with our method. How well has it worked in the past for us to look at outcomes and then adapt our system so that next time the outcome will be a bit better. It has to be a constantly dynamic situation where we learn from whether the good outcomes we expect actually happened and whether the action is thus warranted that we're entertaining. And again, the imperative to learn from past mistakes. I'll just add something, a personal anecdote as a clinical ethicist. I can't believe how often when you're talking to a family or a patient that's been the victim of a clinical error or a clinical mistake, how often, the response isn't anger. It's something like, I can understand that you made that mistake. I just want to make sure that you and your team have learned from it, so the next person that comes down the pipeline is less likely to suffer the same mistake. I just can't believe how frequently that sentiment shows up in people. So I think I spoke about these, that each of them has something to teach you. I think if you just did a quick Google search of any of these and spent a few minutes reading, you'd see why that, learning about how Florence Nightingale revolutionized the concept of bedside nursing, or how Hippocrates, in writing down his recommendations 2,500 years ago, laid a foundation that never left about the physician's fundamental dedication to patient well-being. And then Osler as a hero that sort of revolutionized medicine 100 years ago and developed good thinking about how it ought to be organized that I think was pretty sound. So things like the Tuskegee syphilis study, which I think Michael mentioned, you know, how do such things happen that, you know, a group of, you know, people who could have been treated of their syphilis are not treated because a group of scientists wants to learn more about the natural history of the disease. And so I think, you know, it demonstrates, along with the obvious, unbelievably shocking behavior of the Nazis, you know, who saw in their prison camps a population of people that they could just do anything with. You know, and so I've spent a fair bit of time studying the hypothermia experiments that Nazis conducted on prisoners of war. You know, just the worst possible things, you know, freezing people, putting them in vats of water, seeing how long it takes them to die and at what temperature, and then pulling them out and, you know, and seeing how, you know, if they can be warmed up. You know, zero regard for the well-being of the people. And, you know, when you get these unbelievably shocking, unambiguous examples of evil, they can really ground a sense of, you know, going forward, we need to do better, which is why the principle of consent emerged in the decade after Nazis, where, you know, it was basically everybody deciding we cannot go ahead and do things, you know, do things to people without asking them first if it's okay and listening to their answer. And the fact that Tuskegee continued for over 20 years past the end of the Second World War shows that while it's easy to point at the Nazis, it wasn't just the Nazis. It was, you know, the whole Western world was, you know, I would say under the guise of an idea that they hadn't yet developed enough respect for the other. You know, that's another discussion. I think we have come a long way in, you know, in that terrible experiments like that, you know, would not only be frowned upon, but I think seen by most people as obviously a bad move. You can't be doing things to people against their will. And then here's just a few examples of medical error. You know, these are the types of things that can happen. You know, people can get the wrong drugs. You know, for years and years, the health system tries to figure out how do we make sure people don't get the wrong drugs. You know, how do we organize them on a unit? How do we distribute them? How do we prevent patient A from taking patient B's drugs? All of these things that slowly develop systems. How do we avoid people getting the wrong leg amputated? You know, you'd think that's just something that should never happen. You know, and I think, you know, simple things like, you know, pull out your magic marker and make all sorts of marks on the proper leg that's supposed to be amputated, things like that. You know, and then Dana Carvey from the Wayne's World movie. He's Garth from, you know, he was the victim of, they fixed the wrong artery in his heart, I think. So just, what are some of the local lessons that we've learned? There's the local political culture, you know, that I think potentially teaches us stuff every day as we see how people deal in the world. In healthcare, anybody who's been around healthcare can look at times of trauma, you know, time in the 90s when a whole bunch of people got cut, and you know, another time like 10, 12 years ago, and how that leaves wounds among staff who don't necessarily forget when they were, you know, when they felt let down by their employer or something. Lots of lessons about bureaucracy and how, you know, what sorts of bureaucracies support healthcare delivery in a good way. And how should we think about the physician-patient relationship in an ever-changing world? And I suspect that one thing the pandemic has done is raised the possibility in a real way that maybe doctors and patients can have a relationship without seeing each other in the same room, which I suspect is potentially a very helpful thing in terms of a longitudinal, closer physician-patient relationship where the two can know each other better without necessarily taking a lot more time. And so where do ethical principles come from? You know, I'd argue they're grounded in the lessons of history, in the sensibilities we develop when, you know, I think it's sort of hard to look at ambiguous things from history because they can sort of imply different lessons. You can take a bunch of different things depending on how you interpret it. But, you know, when we get absolute slam dunks where there's sort of no two ways about it, I think they stand to mold our ethics in a good way. We respect the autonomy of patients, or at least we try to profoundly, when we're reminded of just how far it went with the Nazis not having a single sense that they need to ask anybody about anything. You know, so I just think in general, studying history and the medical humanities is probably very good for clinicians, you know, in terms of their ability to judge, to read people, to read situations, to understand the background, the political background and the history of their profession, all of things that might play some role in the decisions they make. You know, and then again, I'd reiterate that we have a duty to learn from adverse events and be able to tell our children and anybody who cares that we really did try to listen at all times to what the world seems to be telling us. And I think, you know, I sometimes you know, just to bring it up to the current situation, I'm wondering whether in the last few weeks, we are listening to what seems to be happening in the pandemic. I sometimes think that we're bound by commitments we made 6 months ago about what we need to do. And I sometimes worry whether we have fully internalized everything we've learned in the last 6 months to decide what best to do now when it looks like as winter approaches that the numbers are likely to go up. And so these are serious decisions we need to make. And I think we need to look carefully at history and know to figure out what is it we should have learned in the last 6 months, you know, and how well do we know that? So that's all the background I wanted to present. You know, just a little. This is how we learn from history, and so I don't want you to have to sit there and listen to me anymore. We should start to have a larger conversation. I think I'm gonna. I'll put my screen on the mode where I can see all of you, and then we'll go around and ask each of you to share what you wrote down. So I'm going to press stop share. I'm already in the gallery mode. So just the order on my screen, I've got Eduardo, Joel, Ashley, Leanne, Taryn, and then the 1587 number. So do you want to sort of plan for 5-ish minutes each to just, you know, tell us what you wrote down, how you answered those questions? Or I guess maybe before we launch into it, any questions or comments about anything I said so far? Okay, so the goal here is to, you know, what have you observed? What are, you know, after you've shared with us what you've observed, what sort of observations about the style of thinking that you seem to employ can you make? You know, and then in the end, I'll give you my, you know, my opinion about whenever we're facing a complex question. I would say, you know, you don't have to think about which of the ethical theories am I going to use? Should I pull out these principles, or should I maximize outcomes, or should I, you know, look at what the rights and duties are, or should I attempt to tell the stories that are going to put together a so-called narrative ethic? You know, in the end, I'd say if it's a really tough question, do all of those things. Let them simmer around in your brain, and then seek what I think Michael described as reflective equilibrium. At some point, as they swim around in your brain, these various things, they should come to some sort of settled state that feels physically in balance, and that's the moment of decision. So anyway, Eduardo, do you want to launch us off with the question of what have you noticed during the pandemic, or what are some of the questions?
Yeah, so you asked, what have I thought in the past 8 months, and what are the ethical questions that have raised?
Yeah.
So as an international student,
Mhm.
I wonder whether in this pandemic situation, if it comes to the worst, I'm being a little selfish, would I be prioritized? Would my health be prioritized before the health of a person that may not be the best, in the best chances of surviving? So the way in which the decision making in the healthcare would happen is not clear to me. If the pandemic gets to a point in which we cannot take in all the people that are getting super sick and like that. And the second question was what kind of ethical, I don't know, set of rules do I follow? And I'd like to think about the trying to get to the best of my ability to who should I be. That doesn't necessarily align with who I am at the moment, but I want to continue aiming to get to that point, and also to contribute ultimately to our community. But sometimes like that healthcare question, I wonder, well, if I should be the best to our community and just give my place to get treated to others, because that would be the greater good for our community. Is that okay, or should we reevaluate things? And that's very selfish, I recognize, for me to say, but I am not a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident. So in that sense, I feel that I'm in a disadvantage.
Yeah, no, I mean, I hear that built into your question, that, as you're wondering where on this strange pecking order, might you fit? And as a non-Canadian, does that bump you up or down? And, and then I think also, lots of other fun, you described it from the beginning as if the worst comes, and I was immediately thinking, what do you mean by the worst? I wasn't sure if you had a T on, was it worse or worst?
Well, yeah, sorry, I should have specified. So if our healthcare system is unable to cope with the disease,
yeah,
if we have a mutation that all of a sudden is beginning to kill everyone, regardless of age,
yeah, I mean, just on that note, I can tell you, I've been an ethicist since about 2000. And so we went through a couple of pandemic scares, and each of, the H5N1 and the H1N1. And, and each time it prompted, quite a few months of fairly intensive planning and imagining how should we prepare for the next one. And I can tell you that whenever we were preparing for the next one, we were imagining a much more lethal agent, something that if you got it, it would be much more serious. And so, the actual unfolding of how this virus has played out, which is, you call it mildly lethal. It's not a huge killer, but we learn that if it's just, if it's going to kill 1% of the people or 0.5% of the people, that's a lot of people, and so I think you're right. We always imagined that, if you had an agent that literally killed 20% of the people that got it, and it was of a similar communicability that it is now, I think that the response would be entirely different. I mean, it would be far more drastic. You know,
Well, and the other thing is that I read a document of, I think, medicine of war from the United States. I'm not very sure of the title, but it was a document where they talked about how medicine would be prioritized, and the aim of the doctors would be to treat those people that have the highest chances of survival,
yeah.
in their view.
Yeah.
But is their view the correct view? Like, I mean,
Well, it's the, you know, it's an excellent question. How well are we able to tell, as when a patient arrives, whether they are a likely survivor or not? You know, what criteria do we have? How good are they? And how well can we apply them? And so this is an area that, you know, for us working in ethics, in the first 2 months of the pandemic, when we didn't know what was coming, a big part of our activity was to plan with these triage teams, what exactly would we do, you know, if, you know, we reach that moment where there's 20 people waiting for 10 beds, how is the sort made? You know, and just very quickly, the general idea is that we'll make that decision according, first and foremost, to survivability criteria. Who physically is most likely to survive based on everything that we know, with the, I guess, the more fundamental idea that getting people to survive the illness is the number one goal. You know, and so really tough questions, especially looking at it beforehand, you know, including the very tough question of, if somebody has now been in an ICU for, you know, 3-5 days and isn't showing sufficient progress, would we actually take the unusual step of pulling them off because they're just not doing well enough, quickly enough, so that somebody else could be put on? Now, I guess maybe the good news for you, you know, is I'd say one of the major things we've learned is that if you do unfortunately need a ventilator, you know, it's a 90% chance that it's, you know, it's too late already. You know, you really want to fight this thing and not end up needing a ventilator. So, I mean, it was interesting as that sensibility creeped in, you know, I'd say somewhere between, you know, week 6 and week 10, that I don't think we're going to need 10,000 ventilators, you know, and, you know, if we had them, they wouldn't be saving everyone anyway. And so that initial crush for ventilators was just based on something we imagined. You know, if this thing is so bad that it's going to fill our lungs with fluid, are a few days on a ventilator going to keep us alive or not? And the answer is, well, it looks like only a small amount of the time. You know, and we also know quite a bit more that, you know, if you're old and infirm, you're much more likely to need it. So anyways, those are good questions. And, you know, I'm not sure if I'm able to tell exactly what type of thinker you are from your answer, but when you said, when you said you tend to think of who should I be, you know, that one might describe that as an ethic of virtue, you know, so I don't think that, I can't remember if Michael mentioned virtue ethics. So the idea that, you know, we sort of know these virtues, qualities that are good to hold, you know, to be compassionate and empathetic and all of that. And we know there are these vices, you know, don't be greedy and whatnot. And so absolutely, it's a very common way of doing ethics is that, you know, I want to be like that. I want to live my life so that these virtues are a part of my personality and I'm able to resist vices being sort of the core thing that drive me. So. Anybody have a question or comment for Eduardo? Okay, I just want to, yeah, I think our time should work out pretty well. So Joel, how did you respond to these questions?
Yeah, so I think for the first question, I had a couple thoughts. What have I been thinking about over the past 8 months? I think the first thing is what responsibilities do we, let's say the healthy population, what do we have for the greater health of you know, people in our society within a pandemic. So this ties to, what extents do governments have to restricting autonomy? And we were seeing recently with a lot of protests on both sides, people like frustrated about all the legislations and mask wearing. So what are responsibilities in these situations? I also talked about how do we decide who gets healthcare and treatment when there's an oversaturation of sick people entering hospitals. And I remember in your course, Gary, you talked a lot about this and how, how do you make decisions when there's limited resources? And I think the examples you brought up, if I recall correctly, are the kidney dialysis. And now we're experiencing that on a massive scale throughout the world. There's so many people, particularly elderly folks, and those are very tough sort of ethical decisions of who should get a bed versus who shouldn't.
So you're not satisfied with the answer, whoever can pay?
I mean, not entirely. I think,
Okay.
when that really begs to another question is like, well, how do you define worth of human life, right? And one could argue that money is linked to worth, but I mean, I personally don't. I think worth is intrinsic, and I think that's the general. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's the general bioethicist view of life being innately, intrinsically tied to value. So there's a lot of questions. There's a lot of really challenging questions that I think healthcare physicians and workers really have to ask themselves. And then on that sort of on a side note is how ethical is it to, given the context in Alberta, how ethical is it to cut healthcare funding during a pandemic? So what is the role of policymakers and, the political perspective? What are the role of governments and lawmakers? And do they have a moral obligation to contribute to bettering our healthcare? But specifically during a pandemic, what are their moral obligations? And sometimes there's all that level of red tape where it may seem like they're removed from consequences, but I think they have a very important role in this, as we've been seeing. I guess I could talk about the second question briefly. I think, given all of that, and given that we're in a pandemic, I think, well, one of the things that stood out to me, what Michael said last class, was the contractualist perspectives. And he mentioned that essentially it's the ethics and morals formed by what we agree to with each other. And that just raised a whole bunch of questions in my mind, because what are people agreeing with nowadays? I think, social media is making us arguably more polarized, and there's so many things that we don't agree with. So how do we come to consensus when there's so many differing opinions, living in a pluralistic society where there's so many varying political, religious, spiritual views, as well as even views on, how to manage health and end of life? How do we reach that consensus? And I think the pandemic has put it on the forefront of many people. One would think that the utilitarian sort of approach, what's best for all, what has the best overall consequences, maximizing welfare is the best approach, but it seems like it's not that simple. It seems like there's a lot more, debate and philosophical, conversations around that. And I think what's been on the forefront of everyone's minds is the lack of time. There's decisions that have to be made very quickly, and we're not able to have those full nuanced conversations. Even with in Alberta having masks being mandatory in indoor places. I mean, when you think about it from a utilitarian perspective, I think that's, you're trying to minimize harm to the most amount of people. But what about autonomy and agency, and from the other perspective, people are bringing up those concerns as potentially contravening charter rights or whatever. So Gary, you talk about how do you reach that equilibrium. I don't know. It seems like it's a process that is normally supposed to take a lot of back and forth. It's supposed to be an iterative process, and I think potentially social media may actually be an anti-equilibrium force in all of this. So those are some of the thoughts that I had with those questions.
Oh no, those are some great comments. I think you're dwelling on the contract is interesting. You probably heard of the idea of a social contract. I think that's something that people hear, and they probably hear it for quite a few years. Like, are there two parties that have sat down and signed the social contract, or is it an implicit contract? And who is it between? And so it is the latter of those. It's an implicit contract. So they often talk about, a profession like medicine that is supposed to have a contract with society, which I think in the end is an attempt to zero in on the details of what are the obligations of each. How can society sustain the profession? How can the profession sustain the society? And I think the advantages of a contract approach is to, let's get perfectly clear on just what the arrangement is. And so while I don't think that our world would be good if every decision had to be a contract between people, I do think contractarianism, the idea that let's find areas there where we agree and disagree and get specific about them, is probably helpful in defining the duties of what people actually have to do in the world. I think all the health professions and other professions would do well to meditate on what is our contract with society. And then simultaneously, politicians, I think, have an interesting, do they have a contract with society, or in fact, do they represent the other side of the contract that exists with doctors or lawyers? Are the politicians the ones that are sort of making the contract with the group of doctors, for example? And I've often thought, do politicians understand their role, as representatives of the public for the public good in the same way that doctors and lawyers do? I mean, I think they should. I think it's if you're taking an oath before you can practice your thing, saying, I promise to do what my profession says I should do and not to screw people because of the advantageous position that I'm in. That's, some type of oath, that's what they do. So I often think that a deeper understanding of these contracts and the proclamations that are made, usually implicitly by professionals or politicians, but maybe we could get more explicit. Now, just to your point about should the rules be? So I've had an interesting experiment. I come home every second or third weekend to spend the weekend and visit with my family. But for most of the recent months, when I go to Alberta, if I want to go into the gas station store or to Max, I've got to put on a thing. It's a rule. Saskatchewan hasn't had those rules. So I am free to not put on my mask when I go into Safeway or whatnot. And so, so I've experienced the difference, and my main comment to my family is I kind of like it being a law, because in Saskatchewan, when you go in, you're subject to all of the things that we're subjected to, peer pressure. So I walk into Shoppers, there's 20 other people there, and they're almost none of them are wearing masks. So normally I think, well, I'll put on my mask, but I think, well, no one else is. Am I being too? So, in that moment, it was sort of, it's kind of nice to have the decision taken out of my hands. I just, kind of have to wear one, don't have to worry about the peer pressure. But I think all of those realities are important to note, and part of the time when you were speaking, I was thinking, well, in order to understand people's motivations and the way they're inspired or not by peer pressure or what other people will think. I think it just shows everything that goes into our decisions. And unfortunately, a lot of it isn't fully rational. I think we would like to think that, when we're weighing all of the potential outcomes, trying to do that calculation of all the goods and evils so that we can make the right decision. It's very hard to do that, and sometimes, when I preach the benefits of studying more psychology and sociology, it's maybe in the hope of getting at what does motivate people within groups and how could we learn that a little bit better. Others responses to Joel? All right, that was great. So Ashley, I got you next. You're right in the middle of my screen. It's like everybody else is making a circle around you.
Okay, so I'm going to preface this with a little bit about me because I don't actually know if I've told the class any of this stuff. But when I think back to the past 8 months, about 8 months ago is when my whole life kind of changed, because I actually had a situation where I had to go to the emerge, and I was diagnosed with just having really bad migraines. But it turned out a week later that I was actually having a stroke at the time. And I had a huge blood clot in my brain, and that was never really righted.
I'm glad you're doing well.
Yeah, but it was never really explained to the process that how did a stroke slip through the emerge room and send me home on migraine medication. And that's never really been rectified, which is kind of I don't know, I don't really know what to do about it. But yeah, so because of that, I've had to also go through a lot of other changes at the same time as the whole world kind of fell apart. And everything I knew fell apart at the same time. So luckily I'm doing okay now and there's not a lot of deficits, and honestly, no one would even know what happened to me if you just look at me. But because of that, I've looked at a lot of things in the disability and mental health kind of aspects of COVID that are really kind of just pushed aside right now. And I'm wondering, is it more ethical to care about, focus more on keeping people safe from the virus than it is to actually accommodate people who have disabilities who need help with other things, or to shove everyone into their own homes and not interact with other people, which is worsening a lot of people's mental health. So which one is actually more important in that case? Because they talk about a lot that I think the suicide rate is increasing right now because nobody knows how to handle this, and it adds to the fact that we're forced to be alone all the time and kind of have these other things because we're trying to keep people safe, but we're also not really keeping people safe. Where also in school, because everyone is treated differently right now, and we're doing everything online and we're doing everything kind of in I don't know, a lot of people are giving assignments and everyone gets more time and everyone is kind of accommodated. So, but the people who are having disabilities aren't really further accommodated than the normal people because it fits within what they originally thought was okay, or what they needed accommodations for. Say you need more time on an exam because you have a disability, because everyone's given more time on the exam, well, we can just lump all of them in and it's fine. They don't need to be treated differently at all, or to be accommodated, or to be recognized that there's something else going on. And that's mostly what I've been thinking about with COVID. And I know that I don't really know what the ethical method that I use, but I base a lot of my decisions not really factoring in emotions. but I also don't really factor in rules because I also believe that there's a lot of rules that are wrong. So I don't really know what my decision making is based off of, because it's not rules and it's not emotions. So it's somewhere in the what's the best for everyone.
Well, so my response to what the first part of your story was to suggest that you seem to be doing what I would call an outcomes-based analysis, a type of utilitarianism, that how do we measure the goods against other goods? And just a little bit more detail. I think you're bang on when you say that we are trying to figure out what are the harms, risks, potential risks of the virus, in its current state. And in order to fully answer that question, you have to look at all the other things. How is the care of the COVID patient affecting all of the other patients? When people who are going to get treatment for cancer and heart disease and all sorts of other things, which is a whole bunch of normal health care, and then you throw on the isolation, the alienation, and the way those can exacerbate mental health issues, which translate into, depression, debilitating depression sometimes, or even suicide. In order to get our calculation right, we need to properly appreciate the costs. And so I know that there have been people thinking about it at the John Doster Health Ethics Center who put on some talks. I know Dr. Ari Jaffe gave a talk last month looking with some specifics at all of the other things that we need to be thinking about. And I think you're right. I think we are in a different spot now than we were. We should have a deeper appreciation of the costs. Not only that, but the costs, I think, will go up. Like if we're really facing the winter, if it's the cold weather that seems to drive the numbers up, and we're in a place where the cold weather isn't just 2 months, it's right till the end of March. And so all sorts of things. I know for me, I continually think about the people in the nursing homes, long-term care centers, who by definition are in the last few years of their life. The average person enters a long-term care center and dies within a couple of years. So that's a statistical reality. And, so I try and do the golden rule analysis. If it were me in that long-term care center, and I think, well, I'm here because I need to be here. I can't stay at home because I need help going to the bathroom or something. And then if I were faced with, well, yeah, you're here and the nurses will be here to help you a couple times a day, but because of this damn virus, you can't get any visits. To me, that wouldn't be just a minor thing. That would be a major thing. And so I would hope that as we enter the winter in the next few months, somebody is properly doing that weighing and balancing, which may indeed include putting some people at risk of dying from the virus, and that's, the difficult thing about the utilitarian calculation, where we're trying to get this idea of, the total sum of all goods minus the total harm of all risks. When I say that it's not a purely rational process, it's sort of implying we don't have accurate numerical values that we can plug in and get the mathematical answer. And so I think when I say that the best you can do is put them in your head, let them swim around, and hope that your gut comes to some sort of balance, a state of equilibrium. I think some way that's the best way that we can drive ourselves and tell ourselves, I've tried really hard and reasonably well to consider everything that I need to consider. And I worry that, in this pandemic, people are thinking too much of safety, too much of let's save, let's minimize the number of deaths, but they failed to count deaths that they ought to be, if those are we know fairly reliably in a population that isolation is going to lead to mental illness and suicide. And so we have to do our best to measure that, to mitigate it, which I think there's probably more we can do. But I know I keep thinking long-term care centers this winter need to find a way to have visits through windows a little bit better. And if I have to put on my snowsuit to go visit with grandma through the window, maybe that's okay, better than not visiting her. So anyway, I think you're a bit of a utilitarian and just thrilled, and then, that little thing, how could they send you home thinking it's a migraine? I mean, it brings in those questions of medical error. And, I'm curious, is there anybody that reached out and said, sorry, we should have recognized this or not? I mean, I don't need to know whether anyone actually did it, but when that happens to people, when it turns out that you've had something and they've sent you home a couple times saying it was something else, it sure would be nice if somebody gave you a call and just said, by the way, sorry, we should have done better. Anyway, any other thoughts or questions anyone has for Ashley? Well, that's good. Thanks for sharing, and very happy that, like most strokes in young people, it resolved.
Yeah. I'm happy you're here because it's important to promote dialogue. But you mentioned in a previous class how the use of a mask seems to be, well, it's for the one who is using the mask is protecting others. And it seems that it's so bothering to some people to wear it. Like, I cannot wear a mask. I cannot be bothered to protect the others, right? So there's that lack of empathy that we are observing here right now. So how would you go around and try to address that?
Well, I mean, it can be a more complex thought. I mean, when I walk into the Shoppers Drug Mart and see nobody else wearing one, my thought changes. It's like, oh, I don't want to alarm you by wearing the mask. Everybody here seems to think it's no problem. And if I put on my mask, I'm going to increase the temperature a little bit, and so, I think the mind plays tricks, and in that moment, I think I probably don't have it. You probably don't have it. The culture of this place is that we don't need to wear masks. We're all good. So I'm not going to upset the vibe. So my thinking wouldn't be, I'm going to decide to put you at risk. It would be, it's more likely that I'm going to make you comfortable, and we'll, just everybody here is going to not wear a mask. So that we don't alarm each other, which again is flawed thinking rationally. When you really think about it, if you go to Shoppers and no one's wearing a mask, all the more reason to wear yours. But, I guess maybe the point is we should understand and accept the inherent irrationality that dwells in all of our heads. And understanding that, I think, helps us overcome it, which is a good thing. So, all right, let's go to Leanne. I got to get through everybody.
I have a couple quick points just on the mask wearing part too. It was kind of interesting because at the beginning, before there was any mandatory mask laws, I would still go, and this was when everything had locked down too. So my brother and I would go to the grocery store with our masks on, and most people didn't wear theirs yet at that point. And we would, you could feel people staring at us because there's the whole sentiment of this being a Chinese virus and stuff like that. So that I found that kind of interesting. And part of the ethical questions that I had, and I'm just reading from my notes here, is that what is the best way to actually get people to follow these guidelines to keep others safe? And I know this is something that we've been talking about that I think Joel and Ashley also brought up, is this idea of autonomy, that people feel that their rights are being infringed upon because they're being told to wear a mask. And whereas it's really about keeping the people around you safe and preventing the spread of that. And for those people who are actively not wearing a mask and actively going out and socializing, going to events where they're increasing the risk of themselves catching the virus and also them spreading the virus, is that considered unethical on their part? They don't consider it unethical, but when I see that as being unethical. They're not like, I just don't think that that's the right thing to do in terms of hoping to keep more people safe. But then again, like, you want to make sure that people's mental health is okay too. So then there's the flip side of that as well. And then the other question that I had was, in terms of when an effective vaccine is developed, how are we going to go about administering it? Because going back to the idea of consent that you had mentioned earlier, people are going to refuse. We know there are people who are anti-vaxxers as is, but then now there are people who believe that this whole thing is a hoax. So how do we do that? And again, if they don't get it, what if they're, my thinking, I know this is like very much overthinking it maybe, but like if they are somehow an asymptomatic carrier of the virus, then what happens when you're not able to have, like, if they don't have the vaccine and they're not, like, all the complications that come around with it, even if we want to get back to a normal society. So yeah.
Interesting comments about the vaccine. I think I've had the thought that the vaccine skepticism might end up working well for us in this instance, as opposed to the situation where if the virus were a little bit worse and the vaccine, everybody was just dying to get it because it would make this huge difference. Then we would have all of these questions of what order do we give it out in? And this is one of the things that happened, 10 years ago. You guys were probably kids, but if you lived in Edmonton, you probably lined up at some center and got a vaccination for H1N1 around 2010 or something. But it was the problem of how do you distribute this fairly in an area where almost everyone wants it. So I think the reluctance, which is not unreasonable, I think that everybody who is among the first group that takes a new drug or a new vaccine ought to see themselves as still kind of guinea pigs. I mean, these things have been approved, but there's still a lot more to learn. So if you are the first generation taking a new product, I would say we would be wise to it, but we should make you consent to that. Say, while it's, this drug or vaccine has passed our tests, we recognize we might still learn more about it. And so I think the fact that we've sort of learned to live without it means that we're not going to be lining up, every one of us, as soon as the first one is available. I'm guessing, it will help sort out the demand. I would see myself as part of a second wave. Like, I wouldn't mind a whole bunch of other people sitting with this for a couple months before I get it, just because that's my level of trust. I am a little bit worried, that they rush the development of it. It implies there are things that they may not have learned about. The question of why does it take so many years to develop a vaccine? I think that's part of the problem, that you end up giving it to some thousands of people in the phase 3 trial, and then you see little side effects that you got to give them time to figure them out. So while the pecking order of the vaccine could be a huge ethical problem that we would need to think about in a triage sort of way, and the answer to that would probably be something: who's most at risk? Healthcare workers. We would set up some reasonable order, which is again what we tried to do in the last one. So I don't know if you guys followed the news then, but there was a scandal because somebody enabled the Oilers to cut the line and get their flu shot more quickly, and it was a big scandal about whether that was reasonable or not. So anyway, that's I'm hoping that that we get a vaccine that solves this crazy problem, and B, that there's that we politely line up over 6 months, that we don't all want it on day one, and that might end up being a practically useful thing.
Mhm.
So, any other comments for Leanne?
I just would like to follow up and know your opinion, Dr. Goldsand, on Leanne's question about what is defined as ethical and unethical in gatherings right now.
Well, one thing an ethicist never does is declare something ethical or unethical. I mean, we would share our opinions, but I would say probably how I answer any question, the best way is the middle path between the important extremes. So consider the danger. I would say erring on the side of safety is probably good. And then recognizing in I would say, really strange and unusual way how the political events of the world are affecting the question of mask wearing. I think in some ways we're in this unique reality of these are not normal times. You've got a very unusual, prominent politician that's driving everyone crazy, just because of the outlandishness on all sides of this political spectrum. So I would say that has added to the politicization of all of this. And I mean, there will always be people waving the flag of liberty, just wanting to say to society, don't tell me what to do. And I guess it's external things that drive how strong that is at any moment. So I don't know. I would say in general, the numbers are clearly climbing in a scary way. If you need me to declare something ethical, it's wear your mask at the very least. And I'll just add very quickly, you should wash your hands, but I know that I've internalized possibly irrationally, that it's all about what I breathe in and out. I've sort of, whereas the first couple months it didn't want to touch a thing, because if you thought if you touched it, you were going to get it. But at some point over the summer, I thought people aren't getting it that way. They're only getting it when they breathe it in. So I've gone from 30 washes a day, just down to 10 or something. Who's next? Kaylin or Taryn? Kaylin?
I can go. Yeah, it's Kaylin, you got it right. So I do have a few questions on this one, and kind of when everyone else was speaking, I thought of more questions. So the first one that I was thinking about that kind of goes back to Eduardo's point is the idea of triage. And should we prioritize giving a vaccine, or not necessarily a vaccine, but a ventilator or a bed to an older person who doesn't necessarily have the best chance of survival over someone that is younger and maybe has more of that vitality in them? And then my second question was, when somebody younger does get the virus, should we assume that, it was like they went to a party, that's how they got it? Whereas a lot of people my age that are in that 20 to 35 demographic who maybe aren't being as careful, there are a lot of people that are, like myself. And so should we automatically assume that because someone's younger, they did something to provoke it, I guess?
No. Don't automatically assume anything.
Exactly, yeah.
In general,
Mm-hmm.
like, I think it's fair if somebody your age gets it, to think, oh, I wonder if that's one of those people who couldn't resist going to the big party, and is now reaping the benefits of that.
Mm-hmm.
So while, I would say, like everything, that's a possibility, but unless you know the details, you should give them the benefit of the doubt that
Mm-hmm.
maybe it was their cousin's roommate that was the culprit, and they're the unfortunate recipients, even though they were doing everything right.
Mm-hmm. I just feel like that, unfortunately, because of the stigma around younger people spreading it and going to places that they maybe shouldn't be. When someone does get it, even if it is innocently, there's that negative stigma around it. And then my third question was, how should I treat my friends that don't quote unquote follow the rules? So I had a friend a few weeks ago, tell me about how they're at odds with their mental health and seeing people versus other people's mental health. Like they want to be chatting with their friends, going to a small gathering or maybe a bigger one, I'm not sure, but that if they don't go, that will affect their mental health. Kind of what Ashley was going along the lines of too. And then another more personal issue was my grandmother is waiting to go into a long-term care facility. And that's been very, very tricky for us because on one hand, we want her to get the best care that she can, and she lives on her own. So she's kind of going a bit like crazy, honestly. And we don't want to impose like a negative mental health on her. But at the same time, if she goes in and there's a lockdown again, or she gets the virus, then there's big questions there too.
Yeah, well, so many of the questions that we've gotten have been around long-term care centers and families dealing with that very question.
Mm-hmm.
Normally, because of their declining health, they need this extra bit of help. But if it's really the case that they're going to go there and be limited to, one meeting a week for 15 minutes, it's going to lead you naturally to think, can we delay the entering into the, and that depends on the family and the resources and who's there and what's the level of need. And so those are very difficult questions. I know
Mm-hmm.
I see my role in the system partly to remind the decision makers of all of these little things that should factor into their calculation. The idea of when an old person gets sick and how do we measure the level of tragedy? I mean, clearly it's not as tragic if the 85-year-old in a nursing home gets it and dies from it as a 40-year-old or a 15-year-old. I mean, I think there's sort of this natural idea. There's this reality that when you are that old and in a nursing home, when we say, well, when you enter the nursing home, you're probably a couple of years from your death. What is it that pushes people over the edge? Well, I mean, it very often is, they get the flu, they get a cold, they get a common disease, and because they're in a state of decline, it's that pushes them over the edge.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes our calculation of measuring how bad is the pandemic and how strong should our actions be, and how should we internalize this reality that it really is 90% of the deaths are elderly people who likely would have died soon anyway. There's no natural way to incorporate that information into our calculation, but we have to try to.
Mm-hmm.
I would say clearly, the one thing that maybe we haven't been talking about enough, because in the world of ethics, we often talk about how do we prioritize people? How do the elderly, if you're 80 or 70 or 65 and you get it and you need a ventilator and you're competing with a 40-year-old, how do we possibly incorporate your age into it? The idea is that we try not to, because we don't want to be ageist. We don't want to have any unreasonable discrimination in such things. I know what's always nagged at me is that a whole bunch of those 85-year-olds who might need a ventilator because they've got it, a whole bunch of them, if you could ask them, would say, well, sure, I'll take one if you've got it, but if there's a 40-year-old that needs it, by all means, I've had a good life and they haven't. So sometimes I think we should do a better job of asking people, would you want to go on a ventilator? Because I think loads of them would say, well, if you got a spare one, I wouldn't mind it, but I don't necessarily need it if it's, if there's somebody else. So I don't think we've gotten to the bottom of how to solve all of those. in all of the discussions we had about triage, again, so much focus on how do we sort out those most likely to survive.
Mhm.
And then the deeper questions, it's like, how do we make sure that we don't have undue discrimination against the disabled, against any ethnic minorities, and you look at the, at the stats, and they're, they suggest that there is a problem, that somehow the divisions within society get reflected in the numbers of success for COVID. So I think we do our best to try to understand that. So one of the practical questions in the triage is, if we've got a bunch of patients that need to go to the ICU, like I said, plan A is to sort them out clinically. What do they have? How bad are they? How likely are they to succeed? But then the question of, should the people who have to decide who gets in, once the clinical criteria are the same, should they know the demographics of the person? Should we tell those people the age, the ethnic background, or should we not tell them? The right answer is not easy at all. Like in some ways you want them to just make the decision based on proper criteria and not let any unconscious bias creep in. But at the same time, it's, those ideas have been challenged, that, maybe we're not able to overcome our unconscious biases, and it would be helpful to know demographic backgrounds, but then that, takes us in another dangerous or complicating direction. So those are some of the realities of, and none of these things are sure.
Mhm.
So hopefully that responds to your question. I'm not sure I answered it, but I know we're already 5 minutes over and Taryn hasn't gone. So if Kim will let us just go for a couple more minutes, and we'll let Taryn share a question.
Sure. She doesn't have a microphone, I think, so she can put her comments in chat, which is usually what she does.
Okay, take your time. I'll give a summary, just where, what I hope we did today. Again, the goal was to get you to think about, where do we get our ethics from? How is ethical theory and ethical principles, how do they play out in the real world? And then an invitation to you to think about, I'm sure you've had dozens and dozens of ethical questions that have popped into your mind, and to have that moment of self-reflection. Are you a rules-based person? In order to, I think many of your questions were a version of, is that ethical? And so in answering that for yourself, that's where you've got to think, how do you define that? Is it, if you followed the rules, does that render it, a good, sound decision? If you skirted the rules a bit, but created a good outcome because of that, is that what makes it, a commendable activity? And then other, and so I think my take-home message would be that if you are probably naturally a rules or an outcomes-based thinker, that your natural thing is to just, how do I get the right thing done, and damn the rules? Or what are the rules? I'll do those, and if the right thing gets done or not, well, at least I followed the rules. And so much of ethics is figuring out the tension between those things. And so hopefully today you just get to self-reflect. A lot of what I attempt to teach physician and nurse trainees is that self-awareness of the things that drive you is very helpful. When you're trying to play a role helping other people, it's really the better awareness you can have of your own motivations and your own self, and usually the better able you are to serve others. So should I open the chat here? Is that where we've got Taryn's comments? Or it's a document?
Yes.
It's a document. If you want, I can read it for you.
Sure. Yeah, I want to.
Sorry, I don't have a microphone on my work computer, and most of the points have been brought up already. Here are some of my thoughts. First, How do we grapple with the reality that some essential workers, for example, grocery clerks, make close to minimum wage? How has this exacerbated already existing inequalities? Would financial compensation even be sufficient to balance out the risk these workers are taking on? Why have these workers had to take on the burden of enforcing mask mandates? So that's the first question. Should I go through the second one, or would you like to answer?
Yeah, give us the whole. We'll try to answer them all in one sentence.
Okay, the second one. For context, I share a lab space with the frontline workers who do the COVID testing, and they are exhausted and extra stressed about getting sick. There is a push to do more and more testing, but I feel like the amount of manpower that goes into performing the testing is often overlooked. What does this mean for asymptomatic cautionary testing? Is it wrong to get a test done just to attend a party? How should testing be prioritized in a way that allows people to live their fullest lives while also not overburdening our testing system?
Really excellent points or questions that I think hone in on very important areas. So I would say, I've given a talk for years that if we really want to plan for a bad pandemic, like when we think of what would the world be like if this thing, instead of killing 0.2 of the people, it killed 20% of the people, you can imagine how different it would be. People would be absolutely frightened. They would go to work far less. So I would say that one of the things we have learned from this reality is the notion of the essential worker. If we shut down society for the sake of wanting to stop transmission, what are the things that have to keep going? And so I had always thought the people that keep our energy and power and water going, they are even more important than our healthcare workers. If we suddenly didn't have water or heat in Edmonton in the winter, disaster. And it turns out that the truck driver, the people who work in the food supply chain from grocery store right to farm, that all them remain essential. And I would say that proper planning should recognize that, and each one of them should be asked specifically, when a big crisis hits, are you able to come to work or not? They should be invited and pleaded with, and then if they do in that time of crisis, I'd say they should definitely get substantial raise and whatnot, and those sorts of incentives. So I've often thought one thing we've learned from many pandemics is that there are lots and lots of heroes and volunteers, and then others who are just too scared, and we should be able to identify which ones are willing to put themselves at risk and get out there, ask them nicely, and I would say have a contract, and so if I'm a young single person, I might be happy to be on it. And then when I've got some little kids at home, I might say, I don't think I can be near the front lines. But I've been trying to tell that to the health system for years and years, that we should ask all of our doctors, especially the people that are that run the ICUs and the ventilators, if they're able to come to work in the worst case scenario. Now the second part of the question, I don't think I can remember it.
She says she shares a lab space with the frontline COVID.
Yeah, I would hope that the powers that be would recognize the testing needs. And the thing is that, you develop this testing regime, and obviously it's helpful if you're in doubt to be able to go get a test. But, if numbers are climbing sky high, then we need to prioritize who gets it. And then when the numbers go down, but we've still got that regime in place, it's logical that more people can go get it. But so I think we just have to accept that it's in flux, and when numbers go high, the standards for testing also go a little bit higher, and maybe suggest to us that let's increase our resources. Hoping for the home test so that you can spit into a cup at home and see if you've got it. And then Terrence says, I think a point is often overlooked that we don't know the long-term effects of this disease. Yeah. I always think about how they wouldn't have known AIDS developed from HIV until a substantial period of time. Yes, I couldn't agree that there's a great deal of uncertainty. Our assessment of how dangerous this is tentative, and we hope it isn't any more dangerous than we think. But I think your point is, we don't necessarily know all of the dangers of this yet. If it so happens that a good percentage of young people who got it have lasting effects, then we should build that into our assumptions. But I don't want to go too much more over time. Again, the goal was to prompt you to think about where you come from, how you've thought about it. I'm hoping that these ethics discussions introduce to you some options about how you might think about things in another way. I didn't spend much time thinking or talking about the thing called narrative ethics, but I'll just throw a plug in. I think often when you don't know what's going on, ask yourself the question, what is the story, of the person in question or of the group in question, and that you tell the story, and sometimes that gives you a sensibility of how we should proceed. So that's a type of narrative ethics. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for giving so genuinely and heartily in the conversation. And feel free to be in touch. I know that you've got some more weeks of this course, and help Dr. Solas in his quest for figuring out what are we going to do with this new medicine and the singularity, and how are we going to figure that out, because we're relying on you guys. So.
Okay, thank you very much for a great teaching session. There are lots of positive comments in the chat too. So I think you've done very well to bring things together. You can imagine with the singularity and the other things we're talking about in this course, some aspects of the pandemic actually make things move faster and others make them move slower. So it's just not predictable how it has, affected timelines thus far.
Well, I mean, I think I'm thinking that the handshake has forever been changed, but I'm hoping that when this is all passed, we all greet each other with a big hug every time.
That sounds good to me. Yeah, great.
Derek, I just have one question for you.
Yeah.
You have all those masks behind you. Do you have one for every day?
Just can't bring myself to throw, for the first month, I absolutely threw them all out because I thought they, it could be polluted. But when I decided that, I've got to put it on when I enter the hospital and walk, 30 seconds to my office. And then if I leave my office, I have to put one on. But I don't think they're ready for the garbage yet. So, and it does kind of look good.
It does. We'll have those on our Christmas trees.
So art for our times. Yeah.
Yes.
That's right.
So.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay. Well, great to see you all, and best of luck in the rest of the course.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay. Bye.
Take care.
Thanks so much.
Bye.